How was Jeffrey Dahmer finally caught, and what was inside his refrigerator? What's inside Jeffrey Dahmer's refrigerator? Jeffrey Dahmer was one depraved individual, and his name has gone down in American history among the worst of the worst killers and cannibals, per biography. He had a pretty normal childhood growing up in Wisconsin, but by the time he was in his teenage years in the 1970s, he began to develop a desire to kidnap, torture, and kill men. Dahmer was left alone in his family's house at age 18 following his parents' divorce. He was a heavy drinker and a loner, and left to his own devices, he killed a man for the first time in 1978, hitting a hitchhiker in the head with a heavy dumbbell. He went on to develop his habit of killing and committed unspeakable atrocities. It took police years to catch Jeffrey Dahmer, but when they finally did, they discovered the abominations he had been keeping inside his refrigerator. The awful smell in his apartment. Jeffrey Dahmer was known to target exclusively men and young boys, and he almost always chose gay men, per biography. After his first murder, he went on to kill 16 other people. Usually, Dahmer would lure men back to his apartment so that he could drug them or ply them with alcohol until they were submissive to him. By 1989, Dahmer had killed 4 men and was in the U.S. court system under sexual exploitation, sexual assault, and child molestation charges. He was allowed on-day release from prison and continued to murder men. Dahmer's experimentation with his victims grew increasingly violent from 1989 to 1991. He began to give his victims lobotomies and sometimes poured acid into the holes he'd created, making the victim almost like a zombie. Even before Dahmer was investigated by police, his neighbors knew something was amiss. There was an awful rotting smell permeating the building, which Dahmer blamed on his faulty freezer, saying he had been gifted some meat by his grandmother but forgot to plug in the freezer to keep the meat from spoiling. Human heads and hearts in his apartment. In 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer's horrific crimes finally saw the light of day. As police investigated his apartment, they found horror after horror. There were 4 human heads in his house, with one inside the refrigerator. There was also a human heart in the freezer. There was also a box of baking soda along with a recently decapitated human head of a black man inside the fridge, but police reported that there was no blood. In an interview, a veteran homicide detective recounted that he was so deeply unnerved by the remains that he nearly fled from the room. Policemen who discovered the head shouted an expletive, and the police later noted that the box of baking soda did literally nothing to conceal the horrible stench emanating from the fridge. Police found 3 more heads in the freezer wrapped in plastic. Then, they looked in a nearby closet, where they found genitals and decomposing human hands inside a large cooking pot. Missed opportunities to catch Dahmer. According to United Press International, police investigated Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment during a time when he had a human body laying in his bedroom. But they dismissed the stench since Dahmer was nicely dressed and instead chalked it up to bathroom odors. Dahmer's neighbors continued to complain about the rotting smell, and Dahmer contacted a carpet cleaner at least twice in the early 1990s to get rid of stained carpets. Dahmer seemed to be regularly cooking and eating his victims' bodies, per the New York Times. If police had properly responded to his victims, they might have found other atrocities in his kitchen sooner, but unfortunately, they botched basically every encounter with Dahmer, letting him go free numerous times. In one instance, Dahmer had been sexually abusing a 14-year-old boy, who managed to break free from Dahmer and tell police his harrowing experience. Even though he was found naked and completely terrified of Dahmer, police hand-delivered him back to Dahmer's apartment anyway. Drum filled with acid and how he preserved his victims. The day they returned the child to the sex offender, there was evidence of bodies in Jeffrey Dahmer's refrigerator. Dahmer said in interviews that if police had examined his home that day, they would have easily found it. There were also heads, skulls, and preserved genitals inside an acid-filled drum. Dahmer later killed the 14-year-old child, plus 4 other victims, before police finally arrested him. Dahmer did all sorts of things with his victims' bodies. He usually photographed them and sexually abused their remains. Dahmer reportedly loved when the bodies were fresh enough to still give off heat. Most of the body parts were relegated to the large acid vat, where it would become a sludge that Dahmer could dispose of easily. But for other bodily remains, Dahmer would preserve them with formaldehyde or boil the flesh off to preserve the bones.